Body, wanna build my body, macho man. Yes, the great song by the Village People about building your body, and many times that will be the goals of your clients, or maybe yourself, because your goal is that you wanna put on muscle. And how do you do that? How much muscle can you put on, and can you put on too much muscle? And some people say, hey, I want to train and get toned, but I don't want to put on muscle, I don't want to get big, says the ladies. When men, on the other hand, they want to look like a Spartan from Spartacus, full of muscles and macho stuff, all that stuff that makes them a macho man. So let's have a look at today at the science, the anatomy, the physiology of putting on muscle, and why some people just have to think about going to the gym and they put on muscle, and other people live in the gym and they put on hardly any muscle. And they say, well, it must be the program, it must be my nutrition, it must be the protein, it must be my supplements, it must be the exercises. Well, how about rather than say it must be, how about we find out what it actually is? So today let's have a look at all the concepts from an anatomical physiological point of view that's going to be conducive to you building the body that you want to build, but also be able to manage your maybe unrealistic expectations of how much muscle you can actually put on. So there's 4 things I'm going to cover today. The first one is genetics, and yes, no matter how much I train a donkey, I'm never going to be able to turn it into a stallion. No matter how much I train a greyhound, I'm never going to turn it into a Rottweiler. So your genetics does play a limiting part, but that doesn't mean you can't change your physique, be getting stronger, putting on muscle, but it may have an effect of how much muscle you can actually put on based on your genetics. And some people are born more muscular, and some people are born less muscular. Some people are born with the potential to put on muscle, and other people not so. You know, we call them in the bodybuilding terms the easy gainers and the hard gainers. You know, the easy gainers, they tend to put on muscle easily, and the other people, they find it hard, the hard gainers. And many times the hard gainers think, if I want to get big and muscly, I have to do what the easy gainers do. And that sometimes can be a formula for injury, and it can be a formula for disaster. So we'll have a look at that in the genetic pool and look at your genetics and be able to show you how to identify some potential benefits and some potential maybe limitations. So genetics, and then after genetics we'll have a look at lifestyle, and is your lifestyle conducive to being in an anabolic state to building muscle? Do you have the right stimulus, and do you have the right lifestyle and the recovery and all that, and all those lifestyle commitments, I suppose, that will help you maximize your muscle growth? Because some people just don't have the lifestyle to be able to put on as much muscle as they can, where others, they do have the lifestyle. Like professional athletes, their whole life is around their performance, and us mere mortals who we have, you may have jobs, or you may have families, you have other commitments, that may be a lifestyle that may limit your potential to put on muscle. Then you have a look at your commitment. Your commitment is, how committed am I to this? Am I prepared to do all the things that I have to do to maximize the amount of muscle I can put on? And that's completely up to you. That goes down to your goals. Why is that your goal? And what are you actually going to be prepared to do to achieve that? And you may say, look, I'd love to have that, but am I prepared to jump all of those hoops and live that lifestyle to achieve it? Some people say, I'd love to have a six-pack, but I don't want to change my diet to the level where I don't enjoy my life to have a six-pack. So this lifestyle may not make you happy to have that physique. That also may not make you happy, but may make you happy when you look in the mirror, but not make you happy when you walk away from the mirror and you have to live the life that you have to live to have that physique, or have that amount of muscle, or have that low percent body fat. And then the last one I want to cover is the principles. To be able to achieve the goals you want to achieve, you have to follow the anatomical and the physiological principles. I was always taught, don't follow the person, follow the principles. And a lot of people follow other people. They say, well, they've got big arms, so I'm going to do what they do. Or they have abs, I'm going to do what they do, and I should get what they have. But you don't fully understand why they have what they've got. It might be because of their genetics, it might be because of their lifestyle, it might be the added little supplements they have in their life to give them that. And therefore you're just following the person, not the principles. And I always say follow the anatomy, follow the physiology, follow the principles, and abide by the laws of that, and then you'll be able to achieve your best your best potential physique that you can achieve depending on what your goal is. So they're the 4 main areas I'm going to be covering today. So let's have a look at genetics. Well, some people, we're all born differently. If you look around, everybody, some are tall, some are short, some have wide shoulders, some have narrow shoulders, and some have big arms, some have little arms. And I guess it's, look, I'm a dog lover, and you look at different dogs. There's greyhounds, and there's Rottweilers, and there's little Shih Tzus, and there's there's little French poodles, and then there's German shepherds, and they're all dogs. But they all have different shapes and sizes, and some are good working dogs, and some are good show dogs, and some are good guard dogs, and some are good love dogs, and depending on what you're born. And if you're born a greyhound, then it's going to be very hard to train you to end up looking like a Rottweiler, but you might be very fast, but you're not going to be very big. I guess you got to look at your genetics, and there's 3 basic body shapes and there's certainly a combination of these, but the 3 ones that you may have heard of is there's the ectomorph, there's the endomorph, and there's the mesomorph. And I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than that, but I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible. Now, the ectomorph are those people who are just naturally skinny, I suppose. They're naturally thin. They don't carry a lot of muscle mass. They're quite very lean. And I guess they're like the greyhound of the human race. They're the greyhounds. They're lean, and they may be lean in many different ways. They might be lean where they're really good at long distance running, like a marathon runner. You know, they're ectomorphs. They're skinny, and you could put them in the gym as much as you want, and you could train them as much as you want with weight training, and even follow the proper principles. But they're never going to turn into a Rottweiler, for example. You know, this is just not going to happen. You can make them a bigger and a stronger greyhound, but no matter what you do, you're going to look at, they're still going to be a greyhound, but they're still going to be, maybe still muscular, but muscularly lean and muscularly skinny, for example. So they might also be the ectomorph, which has a bit of fast twitch muscle fibers in them. So rather than slow twitch like marathon runners, they might be really tall like high jumpers. So they've got quite explosive, they've got a high power to weight ratio because they've got those fast twitch muscle fibers. They're not big, but what they've got is powerful. And then they're really good with explosive type activities, volleyball, high jump, stuff like that. So that's the ectomorph. And the ectomorphs, if they say, look, I want to become a different morph, then that could be a challenge because that's their basic genetics. Then you have what we call the endomorphs. The endomorphs are those people, I guess they're like the British Bulldog. You know, they tend to carry a bit of extra fat on them. They tend to be a bit chubby. They tend to be fatty type thing. They tend to always have challenges of being lean. They always seem to be, for whatever reason that might be. I'm not going to open up that Pandora's box and go down to the reasonings behind it, but that's just the way it is. So it's not that they can't put on muscle, and it's not that they can't get lean, but they will probably find it a bit harder to get rid of the fat as a ectomorph who seems to eat whatever they want and they never tend to put on fat. So the endomorph seems to be that person who carries a bit more extra fat on them. They probably have a bit more muscle than the ectomorph because they have fat and muscle, but that bit of muscle is covered up by fat. So certainly you can get rid of the fat because obviously that commitment to a lifestyle that with diet and exercise you can trim that down, but they may find it a bit more difficult trimming all the fat off. And then you have the mesomorph. The mesomorph is that person who's naturally muscular, they're naturally solid. I remember when I was at school, because when you're at school, you're all a bunch of young kids, my primary school and going into high school, we all pretty much an even platform because you all don't necessarily go to the gym or lift weights, we're just naturally kids running around the playground. And you have kids who, like Alan Main, who was a skinny guy, I always remember Alan, and then we had Pat O'Shea, who was just naturally muscly. He had muscles on muscles, but he didn't do any weight training. That was just the way he is. Then we had Peter Hill, who was just naturally fat. So they're the kids that I remember in the playground. We all did pretty much the same thing. We didn't do any extra training or supplementary training, but we just had those physiques. And that's just called genetics. Means, are you more conducive to muscular? And that could be a cultural thing. Different cultures will tend to be more conducive to muscularity. I live in New Zealand and I'm surrounded by the Māoris and the South Pacifica and the Tongans and the Samoans, and they're naturally very solid. They're just strong people, and that's why they make up a lot of the team in the All Blacks, because they're big, they're strong, they're fast, they're conducive to put on muscle, but they're also conducive to have a bit of fat too. So they're probably a combination of the the mesomorph with a bit of endomorph in there. You don't get a lot of rule. You do. I'm not saying that you don't, but I'm looking at when I say a people or culture, or whatever it might be, or whatever I might say today, it's the main 80%. You're going to have those fringe contradictions to that, but you're not going to get a lot of ectomorphs. Most of them are going to be fairly solid. If you look at for the African Americans, if we've got the Olympics coming up, the African Americans seems to be more muscular. So if you look at the lineup at the Mr. Olympia Bodybuilding Championships, and I'm using an extreme example here, but most of them are going to be African American or that some form of descent. If you trace their origins, they're going to probably come from the west coast of Africa, where they're more solid, rather than the east coast of Africa, where the Ethiopians and the Tanzanians and the Kenyans are, where they're more going to be more long distance runners. So they're more ectomorphic on the east coast and mesomorph on the west coast. Depending on where your cultural background is, that will have an effect on whether you're going to have the ability to put on a lot of muscle or not. So if you look at the 100 metre sprint in the Olympics coming up, you're going to find most of them are going to be from Afro-American descent, due to the fact that they tend to have more fast-twitch muscle fibres. So they're going to be more explosive, they're going to be faster. And because fast-twitch muscle fibres are larger than slow-twitch, you have more fast-twitch, you're going to be naturally bigger, because fast-twitch muscle fibres are bigger. So they're going to make your muscles bigger for power and strength and explosiveness. On the other hand of that, if you look at genetics, if you go to the swimming pool, you're not going to find a lot of African American descent swimmers, because they're more muscular and they have a low percent body fat and they have more muscle density. They don't have as good buoyancy in the water. So it's not that they can't swim or can't be really good swimmers or not great swimmers, but at the elite level, that buoyancy where you find that I guess the white descent will float a little bit better, therefore they're going to go through the water a little bit faster than someone who's sitting lower in the water. So again, I'm not going to go down that path, but that's looking at the extreme examples of how maybe your genetics or your cultural background, which is your genetics, can have an effect on your ability to put on muscle and how much you can actually put on. So we all can put on muscle, but the question is how much and how easy is it going to be, or how hard is it going to be? I'll talk more about that as well. Genetics also is not just about your natural genetics and physiology, but it also might be your bone structure. If you want to go into maybe bodybuilding, competition-wise, do you have the good bone structure to do that, and the basic shape? And what we do know from the principles or the characteristics of muscle, or the elasticity principles of muscle can, you can make it bigger or stronger, but you can't actually change its shape. You can lengthen it and shorten it, but you can't change its shape, and that's genetics. So some people you find that naturally have big arms, and some people have small arms, and some people, like my wife Rory, she has amazing calves. She doesn't do any calf work, but her calves are amazing. Bodybuilders go, oh, I wish I had those calves. Well, she was born with those calves. She didn't do anything in particular. She wears a lot of high heels, so people say, well, maybe I should wear high heels to get those calves. Well, you can, but it's not going to work, and then you're going to look a bit odd, particularly if high heels don't suit you. So do you have the correct bone structure? I know when I did bodybuilding in my younger days, yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I have fairly good genetics from an athletic point of view, but I didn't quite have those level of genetics which I could see that I'd go to the elite level of bodybuilding, and my passion was in other combat sports and martial arts anyway. But I've got a little bit wider hips, so I haven't got that little narrow waistline. I'm never going to get that. I've got a fairly good chest, and certain body parts are good, and so some body parts are great, and certain body parts are quite lacking. So can I change that? Well, I could try, but straight away I've got a bit of a limitation to start with. I remember training one of my younger clients many years ago. His name is Troy. He was only 16. He fell in love with bodybuilding, and he just loved bodybuilding. And I said, look, commit to it. Do what you love and love what you do. However, the challenge, one thing with Troy, he just had no arms. He had a fantastic chest. His big chest had huge lats, and he had great quadriceps. But his calves, they looked like long ankles. So no matter what he did, he couldn't build his calves, and he had little arms, just like long wrists. He's quite amazing. He had this big torso, but these little tiny arms. No matter what he did, he couldn't build the arms. He still competed, and he won the Mr. Queensland, Mr. Junior Queensland bodybuilding championships, which was fantastic. And we had a good chat. And I said, look, I recommend you keep doing what you love and take it as far as you possibly can. But also remember, you have some possible limitations to you. He had wide hips, he had a big butt, he had tiny calves, he had no arms, had a great chest, great back, great quads. So yes, he went as far as he could, and he even went across that line and started to taking some additive chemicals in the syringe, you could say. He went on to steroids and all that bit, and yes, he just became a bigger version of himself. He still had his arms relative to my arms were big, but arms relative to his chest and back was quite small. So he looked a bit out of proportion. So that's where that skeletal shape, the muscle shape, can have an effect on your potential to maybe be a competitor. But if your goal is just to put on muscle, by all means, you certainly can. And we'll talk about that in the fourth sector called the principles of training that's going to make you a bigger or stronger or a better physical version of yourself. And you can certainly make a change. But also, it's also important that maybe why am I getting the results that I expect? Well, maybe expectations are attached to a mesomorph, but you're an ectomorph, and you think if I do what they do, then I'll become that. Well, you can get a greyhound living the life of a Rottweiler, and it's not going to become a Rottweiler. No matter what you do, you're just going to be a greyhound trying to pursue to be what you can't be, but you can pursue to be better than who you are. So there are some of the things to take into account when it comes to genetics, and to be able to manage your expectations. And I'm not one to say you can't do it because I've been proven too many times, but also realises that okay, this is maybe some of the reasons why I'm not making the progress that I could be making. That could be my genetics, but maybe you can overcome your genetics by doing some other things in your life that's going to be, be able to overcome those limitations. So the next point is lifestyle. Is your lifestyle conducive to putting on muscle? Is your lifestyle conducive to stimulating the body and then, to a catabolic state while you're training, and then turning into an anabolic state that's going to put on muscle tissue? So always remember, when you start to follow the person, not the principles, and the person is that you're following the training methods of, say, a Mr. Olympia or a bodybuilder or whatever. First of all, you have to understand they have different genetics to you, and that might be one of the reasons why they're in the top of their game in that field. Not to take away that great genetics do has to be followed up by great lifestyle and great training principles and great commitment and all of those types of things. But you've got to also think, okay, look at their lifestyle. If they're a professional bodybuilder, their whole life is wrapped around training, recovery, growth, food. Everything is pretty well measured. They have a set pattern of what they go through. They do their training. It's regimented. They don't have any other commitments. It's like a professional athlete. They have no other commitments. And when I was working with Olympic sporting teams back when I was running my business called Sports Elite, where I was to train elite athletes, a lot of those guys and girls were sponsored by the government through the Australian Institute of Sport. So they didn't work. All they did is train, eat, sleep, rest, recover, get therapy, get massages, get physio, and go back out and train again. And that's all they did. And so their whole lifestyle was conducive to performance, to their goal, to improving their results. So results don't just come with training. This is great. Training is only one part, but you have to follow that training up with the great nutrition, great recovery, great stress management levels, great recuperation, whether it be massages or therapy or what it might be. So you have to look at your life and think, is my lifestyle conducive to that? Now, not to say that you're not going to train, you're still going to train, but sometimes maybe the limitation could be that you have a very high stress job. You're working 60 to 80 hours of work a week, and when you're stressed in a lifestyle of stress, whether it be physical or psychological stress, that still puts that body into the alert tension phase of releasing cortisol, where it releases all your energy levels to hunt and flight. So even though you may not be, it's just physical stress, such as training, but you also have that mental stress that puts your body into a catabolic state. So stress in itself, constant stress, certainly is not conducive to getting your body into regeneration and growth and putting into the anabolic state. Because if you're stressed, that releases cortisol, which is a catabolic hormone that puts your body into a breakdown phase. If you don't follow that up with rest and recuperation and get rid of the stress and give the body time to go into an anabolic state where it starts to recover, regenerate and build, then you're always going to be constantly in that catabolic state. So understanding elite athletes and elite bodybuilders or professional bodybuilders or professionals, they'll train and put that real quality stress, physical stress, psychological stress in their body, and then they'll go back into having a nap and relaxing and eating and laying on the beach and tanning their body and all that bit, and their body goes straight into that regeneration anabolic state after the catabolic state. But if you're always in catabolic, whether it be stimulated by physical intervention or constant, even low level psychological intervention of stress, whether it be stress over your family or stress over your job or stress over money or just constant stress, then that can have a dampening effect on your body's ability to regenerate, recover, overcompensate, and be able to go into anabolic state of growth. So look at your lifestyle, and you may have to say, well, I may need to manage a few things to make sure I have those times where I get good sleep, good rest, good recovery, get rid of the stress, all that stuff, so my body can actually go into that repair stage or that building stage. So lifestyle could be a limitation depending on your lifestyle and how much of your lifestyle you can actually manage. And if you can't manage a lot of it because it's out of your control, because you have a boss and you have a big mortgage, you have to make the money, you have to work the hours, and you got 4 kids and you're going through all of this, then you say, okay, look, I'm going to do the best I can, but I also understand I'm never going to get to the genetic potential that I can possibly get to because my lifestyle might be one of the limitations. And that's something that you can manage, but just remember, in lifestyle you have to stimulate the body to get the physiological change, but you've got to give that time in your lifestyle for the body to create that physiological stage, from that catabolic stimulus on the body through training, and give that anabolic time in rest and recovery generation for it to make those physiological adaptations, because all your physical changes in the body happen after the physical intervention of training, and you have to make sure that that time is a lifestyle that's going to be conducive to putting on muscle size. So there's some things to also consider on managing your goals and managing expectations, and how you can maybe change that to get the best out of what you got. The next point to consider is your commitment, and certainly you can achieve most things that you want to achieve depending on, obviously we talked about your genetics and how much you're prepared to change your lifestyle to be conducive to achieving the goal that you want to achieve. For example, I do martial arts, and one of the ladies, Justine, she's competing to get into the team to go to the Olympics. So she's committed a whole life at the moment to getting selected for the national team to go to the Olympics. So everything else doesn't matter. And she only has this one window of opportunity in her life before she gets maybe too old where she won't be able to compete. And you've got that window of opportunity to maximise those physical qualities that you have from being youthful and having those great genetics. And now she has to commit to the lifestyle. So the question is, how committed are you to achieving this goal? And you may say, look, I would love to have that, but am I prepared to do what has to be done? And am I prepared to sacrifice and not do the things that I want to do to achieve that particular goal? Now, for example, you may say, look, I'd love to have a six-pack, but I like my wine, I like my food too much. So then, yes, that's a nice dream to have a six-pack, have no fat or whatever it might be, but you have to make that, if you want that, you may have to make the commitment that you may have to give up some things that you love to get that other thing that you love. But sometimes you can't have the two loves, to, I guess, that elite level. So the question is, are you committed? Are you driven enough and disciplined enough and committed enough to achieve the goal you want to achieve? Now, you can always put on muscle, you can always change your body shape, you can always get into great shape with managing all the areas of your lifestyle. But if you want to go to that elite level, I suppose, depending on what your goal is, then that elite level is going to take extra commitment, extra sacrifice to get there. So any, say, bodybuilder, for example, gets on stage at 4 or 5% body fat, or female 10 to 12% body fat, they've made quite significant sacrifices to get there. Maybe they didn't have to make all the sacrifices, we'll talk about that when you look at principles, but they had to have that discipline to get there. They had to give up stuff, give up lifestyle, lifestyle pleasures to get to where they want to be. They want to make sure, are you prepared to get the amount of sleep? Are you prepared to do the training? Are you prepared to eat the way you should be eating ideally to maximise that? Are you prepared to sacrifice all the other lifestyle things that other people are doing? If you're training for the Olympics, you're not be going out partying at night or on weekends. You're not going to be chasing girls or boys. You're going to be at home resting, getting ready for your next training session. So life is all about training, recovery, performance. So you have to say, what commitment am I prepared to do? And we talk about this when you're training with a client, as we through the initial consultation with the W questions. What is your goal? Why is that your goal? So you're finding out the emotional driver. Where do you want to achieve that goal? Where do you want to lose fat? Where do you want to put on muscle? Where do you want to apply that benefit of your goal to, whether it be on the sporting field or whether it be in travelling or in your lifestyle? And when do you want to achieve it? That puts a timeline where you're going to design a committed program to make sure you achieve that. And when you go through that, you say, how do you feel if you achieve it and how do you feel if you don't? So if they don't achieve it and there's no much pain to it, then they're probably not going to do it. But if they don't achieve it, they go, oh my gosh, if I haven't achieved it, then that's going to be, it's going to be painful, that's going to be so disappointing. So the bigger the gap between the pleasure and the pain, the better. You want great pain if they don't achieve it, and you want great pleasure if they do achieve it. And then you ask, if you keep doing what you're doing now, will you achieve it? And what are you prepared to do? What are you prepared to commit to make sure you achieve that goal? Now, depending, obviously, the bigger the goal, the bigger the commitment. Natural. Bigger the goal, bigger the commitment, bigger the sacrifice. Smaller the goal, and when I say the goal, relative to them and where they are and how far they are away from that goal. So the bigger the goal means how far they are away. The smaller the goal, it's closer to them. And so you have to find that commitment. You have to ask that yourself, or if you're working with a client, you have to say, what are you prepared to do, and will you do it? And are you 100% committed? Are you 100% in? No matter what. And what has stopped you in the past? What are those things that stop you? What barriers or what obstacles have stopped you from achieving that, whether it be people or things or psychological. And so find what those things are. So that next one on commitment is really, really important, because don't start a journey unless you're committed to it. I say when I'm working with people, whether it be working with people in their education to become qualified to become a great successful exercise professional, or I'm working with clients who want to achieve a sporting goal, whether it be a world championship in martial arts or whatever it might be, I say, are you 100% in? Because my philosophy is, if you're 100% in, I'm 100% in. But if you're only 99% in, I'm 100% out, because that gives you that backdoor 1% to give up, quit, and not achieve it, and give you that excuse or a reason. It might be an excuse, but you call it a reason. No excuses. You can achieve goals, or you can make excuses, but you can't do both. So that commitment is a really important one to have from a psychological point of view for yourself, if you want to achieve that, putting on muscle size, and obviously take into account your genetics and your lifestyle and your commitment in what you are prepared to do and what you're prepared to sacrifice to achieve your goal. And the last one is principles. Once you've identified genetics and you manage your expectations based on your genetics, you identified your lifestyle and you manage what you're prepared to do in your lifestyle, and then you've decided how much you're prepared to commit to, then you have to design your program based on your genetics, based on your lifestyle, and based on your commitment. So if I'm going to design a program based on Mr. Olympia, and I don't have their genetics, I don't have their lifestyle, I don't have their commitment, and I just go through the processes of training as much as they're training, it's not going to get me the result. If anything, I'm going to burn myself out, because my body and my lifestyle, my genetics, my lifestyle commitment is not conducive, or is not going to be a foundation for that volume of training or that intensity of training. Therefore, if I start training like that, I'm going to probably end up hurting myself, because I'm doing too much training. Because remember, they're all about recovery, and they also take added help, not just in nutrition, but in other additives into their diet. Understanding, when you're at that stage, it's not natural. They are taking their physique to an unnatural level of muscle mass. That's one thing to really understand, is that when you use a role model or person as a role model, and they might be a Mr. Olympia, then that is not a natural physique. That is not how the human physique is supposed to be. Remember, our physique, our muscularity, our strength, our speed and power is all based on hunting and gathering and survival. So if you have someone who has arms, 20-inch arms and massive, well, that's not a hunting physique. They're not going to be chasing many rabbits or chasing the deer or the gazelle with a physique like that. That's taking your genetics beyond its genetic potential by adding in extra chemicals and extra supplements that may not be legal, and that's going to take your body beyond what it's supposed to be. So that's really important to understand, is that you may look at someone who is massive and they may not be naturally massive, or they're massive because they just have that genetics or that culture, and if you to try to do the things to get to that, you end up breaking yourself. I need to push and train, and before you know it, you're overtraining, you're getting diminishing returns, you're hitting training plateaus, you start to decrease in performance, and you just injure yourself. If I train like an elite marathon runner, I'm going to hurt myself. I've run numerous marathons and I've competed in numerous bodybuilding championships, but I've always trained based on my body and my genetics and my anatomy and physiology and my lifestyle to make sure that I don't hurt myself. And when I go marathon running, I can't do the volume of running than say a 60 kilogram ectomorphic greyhound gazelle does, who from the east coast of Africa, who came out of the mother's womb running. If I did that type of running, that would hurt, that would damage me, because I'm heavier set. I'm 80 to 90 kilo, where they're 60 kilo, so every impact on the ground is a wearing effect, and if I do that amount of volume of training, I'm going to end up wearing myself down. So it's what's really, and I see that a lot even in the other extreme of marathon running. They said, I'm going to run a marathon, so I'm going to do a program based on an elite marathon runner. Well, you end up hurting yourself because your body's not designed to do that amount of volume or that frequency or that intensity of training, because you're not designed. If I start training a Rottweiler to run around a track like a greyhound, and I start whipping it, come on, you can go, I end up hurting the Rottweiler because it's heavy set and it's not designed to run that way, as the greyhound is not designed to be a Rottweiler. So what's important is to design your training principles taking into account all those other aspects and points that I mentioned. But the training principles are principles, so they can be applied in your training program, but you have to still follow the principles or the laws of anatomy and physiology and physics. So let's have a look at basically how you get your body to change. So what you have to do, you have to disturb the body, you have to create a stimulus in the body, you have to provide a load in the body. And if you provide a load or a stimulus or a stress in the body, then the body is an adaptive organism and will always continue to adapt to its environment. You see this in the natural, though. People go to the beach and they'll lay in the sun to get a tan. And I've tried to do that in my younger years, but as you can see, I have an Irish descent. So I'm naturally a fair, freckly type of guy, skin. And if I go in the sun, then I tend to not tan, I tend to burn. What I do is I go red, then I go pink, then I go back to white again, and I tend to skip that tanning process somewhere. But when you're young and you feel that you need to put on muscle, as I was, put on muscle, get a tan, and the girls will fall in love with you, which unfortunately they didn't, or maybe fortunately they didn't. I found that I was trying to achieve things which I couldn't achieve. I could put on muscle, but the tan was always a bit of a challenge. So I'd get a little bit of a tan, but it wasn't really a convincing godly tan from a Greek god. And what I end up doing is just getting burnt, and look at now I've got lots of little skin cancer treatments and all sorts of stuff from me trying to go against my genetics, where other people tan very easily. Like my wife, Rory, she's very brown and she tans very easily. Because she is an Eastern Bloc descent from Hungary, and she has that genetics to tan, where I don't have those genetics to tan. So not that I can't tan, but I can't go out in the sun as long as my wife, and I can't be out there as hot as it could be, so I just have to manage my exposure to smaller doses, low intensity doses, so I don't burn myself and end up with sunburn blisters and sorts of stuff. So the same principles apply, but obviously that's where genetics has a difference. But we are adaptive organisms. Everyone can get a slight tan, some more than most. If I put stress on my skin, I used to be a gymnast when I was younger, and I used to do the high bar and the rings and the pommel horse, so your hands get a bit of a beating. But what I found is when I rub the hands would be rubbing up against, and I put the chalk dust on, I started forming calluses. So what I did, I created stress, which is the wear and tear and friction of the rings and the high bar, and that friction would wear the skin down, and sometimes I'd have blisters and cuts and all sorts of stuff. But over time, when I gave that time to regenerate and recover and what we call overcompensate, I'd start to form a callus. So what do? You create a stimulus, you let it rest, it regenerates, and it regenerates thicker and stronger and bigger in the form of a callus, and they create a stress, and eventually I end up having very calloused hands. It's like a workman's hands, who's a labourer who shovels all day with no gloves on. You look at the hands and they're like gorilla hands with very thick, padded calluses there. Well, you have someone who's an IT person who spends their life on the computer, they'll have soft, very thin, no calluses on them. So the body will adapt if you create the right environment for it to adapt to. So some of the principles is they have to provide an overload, a stress, a stimulus on the body. Now, that stimulus is really important, whether you want to put on muscle size, you want to increase cardiovascular fitness. Obviously, you want cardiovascular fitness, you have to put an aerobic stimulus on it, where you get the hearts and the lungs and the respiratory and the cardiovascular system. You need a stress not just on the muscular system, but particularly on the cardiovascular and the respiratory system for it to change. So if I want to get fitter, I need to do more fitness, cardiovascular type stress activities, such as running and hill sprints and interval training and so on. But if I want to build muscle, then muscle is designed to express high amounts of force, so I need to put high loads on that muscle. So that is the stimulus. We'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So you need to provide a overload, not just a load that's normal, a overload, a load that is beyond what your normal is used to shock the body up, not just shock the muscles up, but also shock up all the other systems in the body, such as the nervous system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, as well as, most importantly, the endocrine system that creates all the physiological changes, and we'll talk about that soon. So you need to provide a load, and then you need to provide rest for that body to adapt to that load. The adaptive process where the body will start to make changes, because the body doesn't want to experience that load. It says, well, that was tough. Hey, well, how can we, if that comes back again, how can we be prepared the next time? So what it does, it will lay down more muscle tissue, will lay down more connective tissue, will do all those physical changes. So when that load presents itself again, it's ready. It says, okay, I'm ready for you now. I've actually laid down a bit more muscle tissue, bring it on. But if you're smart and clever, what you do if you wanted to adapt again, you put a bigger load on it as it adapts. So that's called the overload, the progressive overload principle. Means there has to be a progressive increase in overload if you want to change your body physiologically. If you keep presenting the same load, there's no reason for the body to adapt or get stronger or put on more muscle tissue. So I guess in the really central, if you're going in the gym and you're lifting the same weight and you're not putting the weight up, if there's nothing changing in the bar, there's nothing changing on you. There's nothing changing in the dumbbell, there's nothing changing on you. Where a lot of the time people fall in love with the process of training and they forget the goal of training. They love the training more than they do the result. So they just go through the process of training, going through the movements, but there's no actually purpose in the movement to increase the load, to get stronger. So that's called the progressive overload principle. As your body, you present a load, the body will adapt to it. As it adapts to it, you increase the load, so it has to adapt again. You increase the load, so it has to adapt again, and you have to have time in the middle between those stimuluses for that time for the body to adapt and to get stronger and put on muscle tissue. So if you don't provide enough, if I'm always rubbing the skin, for example, and I'm not giving it time to rest and recover, regenerate to form the callus, I end up wearing the skin down to the bone and it starts to bleed and all sorts of stuff. And I remember that when I was doing gymnastics, if I was, I got really into training, but if I didn't give my hands enough time to rest, they started to crack and they started to bleed and they started to get, because I wasn't letting the body regenerate that part where I was providing the stimulus. which is the wear and tear and the friction of doing gymnastics, or whether it be weight training is what you're going to be doing. So that progressive overload principle is vital, where you create the stimulus, you rest, then you create a greater stimulus, then you rest. Remember that adaptations occur when you rest. I don't tan when I'm in the sun, I tan after I'm in the sun. So I used to go sun, go a little bit of red or pinky, and then over time that red or pinky would turn into a bit of a tan, and then over time, if I didn't go represent myself in the sun again, because it went into the winter month, I went back to white again. See how the body's amazing? It just adapts to the environment. The same applies with calluses or anything for that matter. So I have to keep presenting the stimulus, and the more I adapt to it, the greater stimulus I can present to adapt even further and further, called the progressive overload principle. And that's also linked into the overcompensation process. So the overcompensation process is you provide the stimulus, which is the overload or the stress. Then as you do that, which might be the training session, the squats, the bench press, whatever it might be, then your performance goes down due to being tired from the training sessions, and your performance goes down. Then you provide time for it to recover. So your body will now recover, and it will regenerate, it will come back up to its previous level of performance. But you need to leave a bit of extra time for it to now to overcompensate or supercompensate, to get stronger, to put on more muscle tissue, to increase your neural drive and all those things, which we'll talk about very soon. Because if I don't provide enough time in between the stimulus and to maximize that overcompensation process, I may start training as I'm recovering and not overcompensating. So what I'm doing is I'm actually not getting enough recovery, therefore I prevent the stimulus again and it goes down. And then I'm on this, every time I even get to the stage of trying to overcompensate, I'm knocking it down by doing another training session. So it's really important to understand that you have to provide enough recovery for the body in an environment or lifestyle that's conducive. Obviously, the more more relaxed and conducive lifestyle to regeneration and all that, then that time will be shorter. But if we have a stressful job and family, that time might be longer for the body to regenerate. So if I have all these other stresses in my life isn't, and I'm active, and I'm also I have a laborious job, then that will intervene with that recovery process. But if I have a lifestyle which I go home and sleep, I lay on the beach and I eat every 2 hours and I have massages, then that recovery might be shorter, such as a professional bodybuilder and elite athlete. But those people are working 60-hour working weeks, as well as they have a stressful life at home with 4 kids, and they also have to work a second job doing a bit of labouring, then you have to make sure that you have that recovery. So you're not going to be able to train as frequently, because you need more time for the body to regenerate. And a principle there is, if I overload the body to its maximal level, means I lift the weight to the best I can possibly lift it, where I can't lift it anymore, where I've really taken the muscle to that level of volitional failure or of fatigue, where I can, and that type of training, that's what we call high intensity training, relative intensity, then I'm going to probably need more rest. So the harder the training, the more rest you need, because the harder the training, the greater the drop and the more time it takes to regenerate. The easier the training, it's not going to be as fast. It's not going to be as long to recover, because I'm not training that hard. So if I train hard, then the more recovery I need. If I'm not training so hard, if I go in the sun and I get a real hard dose of sun, it's going to take me a while for me to regenerate and get rid of the sunburn. But if I just go in the sun for a short period of time, then it's not going to take as long for me to recover from a little bit of sunburn than an intense amount of sunburn, if that makes sense. If I've got a little light rub, then it doesn't take time for that to, it doesn't take very long for that to recover. But if I really rub into it, then it may take longer. So that's a really important principle to take into account, of how hard you're training and what is your lifestyle, and how does that fit into the super and overcompensation process. So the harder you train, the more rest you need. That's basically what that means. The harder you train, the more rest you need. So that's taking into account the progressive overload principle and the supercompensation process or overcompensation process. And you put into that, your genetics will have an effect on your recovery rate. Your lifestyle will have an effect on your recovery rate. And obviously your commitment will have an effect on your recovery rate. So the more committed, the better the lifestyle, the better genetics, you may find you recover faster. But if you find that that's not the case, then you may need to recover longer. You may have great genetics, but you train really, really hard. Really, really hard. That means it's going to be shorter. But if you don't train as hard, if you train really, really hard, you need longer time to recover. If you don't train as hard, you will probably recover faster. So these are things to take into account, because it's very personal for everyone of how hard they train in their lifestyle and their genetics. So the load. Let's have a look at the load to stimulate muscle growth. Now, what is muscle made of? Well, muscle is made up of muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils, which are made of myofilaments. So if you get down to the cellular level, a muscle is made up of filaments called actin and myosin filaments and cross bridges that connect the two together. So actin and myosin filaments are proteins, and basically that's where these filaments slide across each other to contract a muscle or to lengthen the muscle. And I'm not going to go into that in this session because that's a whole session in itself. But muscle is made up of muscle proteins, actin and myosin filaments, and you can lay down more actin and myosin filaments in a fibre. So you can't create more fibres, that's called hyperplasia, but what you can do is you make each fibre bigger. And the muscle is made up of 60% water, you have all the proteins in it, the actin and myosin filaments. The overall muscle itself is also made up of things of fascia, which is a very small contribution to the muscle size, and it's not as an active tissue as the muscle belly, for example. It tends to hold things in place like a coat, holds everything in. And the connective tissue, it's also made up of things such as glycogen or energy cells, glycogen and fat cells. Again, that's not going to be a massive contributor to the overall muscle size, but it can be a little bit more. So glycogen and your fat cells, because a lot of people carry fat intramuscular in the fat in the muscle itself, and it's also made up of cells such as your mitochondria, your SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum, that contains the calcium for muscle contraction, the mitochondria where your aerobic metabolism occurs. So these are cells in the muscle, but they're all going to be, yes, they're significant, but they're only a smaller level of significance. Most of your muscle mass is going to be made up of your muscle belly, made up of your actin and myosin filaments in the muscle fibers. So how do you stimulate those muscle fibers? And in those muscle fibers are what we call satellite cells. And these satellite cells, you put tension or stress or stimulus on the muscle that it's not normally accustomed to, and it says, hey, we need to get stronger, we need to lay down more protein, so it stimulates the satellite cells to lay down more actin and myosin filaments. That makes each fibre thicker, therefore it gets bigger. Now, if you know a little bit of anatomy, so I'm assuming you do, you have two types of fibres, and there are subdivisions of that. You have your slow-twitch muscle fibres and you have your fast-twitch muscle fibres. Slow-twitch, fast-twitch are called fast glycolytic, and you have your intermediate fibres called your fast oxidative glycolytic. So the fast-twitch muscle fibres are responsible for high levels of force, high levels of tension, high levels of power, high levels of strength, and they're big fibres. They have a big new motor nerve, big motor end plate, and they have a powerful motor drive from the nervous system, and they can express high amounts of force. And they're the big fibres. You also have the slow-twitch muscle fibres, and they're small fibres, so they're more aerobically inclined, where your fast-twitch are anaerobic inclined. These ones are more for endurance, cardiovascular activities, and so on. But they're small, so they don't make up a large size, a big part of the muscle belly. So if you look at the extremes, a marathon runner has more slow-twitch muscle fibres, maybe 80% slow-twitch fibres, and they're small musculature, but they can run forever. On the other extreme, you have the fast-twitch muscle fibre, the 100-metre sprinters, and they're more muscular, and they'll maybe have 60% of their muscles will be fast-twitch muscle fibres, and they're bigger because the fast-twitch muscle fibres is a bigger fibre. So if you want to put a muscle size, which one of those two fibres would you target to get maximal muscle growth? Well, of course, you would attack and provide a training stimulus that would stimulate the fast-twitch muscle fibres, which means you're going to be lifting heavy loads. Heavy loads means heavy relative to you, not relative to someone else, because what might be heavy for you might be light for someone else, and what might be light for you might be heavy for someone else, because it's all relative. So when it comes to training, you want to be lifting heavy progressive loads. Progressive means you're getting stronger. So how do you activate the fast-twitch muscle fibers? You activate them in the phosphate energy system. Now you have three systems: the phosphate, the lactate, and the aerobic. Now the more you go down the energy timeline towards aerobic, the more you're going to be using your slow-twitch muscle fibers and not even activating the fast-twitch muscle fibers. So fast-twitch muscle fibers are going to be activated in the phosphate energy system that lasts up to about 10 seconds. So how many reps can you get in a set in 10 seconds? Probably around about up to 6 repetitions. So when you're looking at training your strength training to maximize muscle size, you're going to be training in that anywhere from 1 to 10, 11, 12 second range. The more you go down, the more you go into muscular endurance, more into activating your slow twitch muscle fibers. So from a repetition range, when I say repetition, it means the maximal weight that you can lift for those repetitions. And the goal is not to perform a set number of repetitions. If I'm going for 5, I don't stop at 5, I try to do 6, I try to do 7, I try to do 8, and then I increase the repetitions. And when I get up to around about that 10-second range and I put the weight up, that brings me back into the phosphate system, activating the fast-twitch muscle fibers. So repetitions from a safe range might be anywhere from 5 to 10, maybe up to 12 repetitions. That's going to be a safe range that you're going to be preferentially activating your fast-twitch muscle fibers, which are the big fibers. Now, even if you're doing a heavy load, you're still activating your slow-twitch muscle fibers, because it's the size principle of muscle activation. The body will always activate the smaller fiber first, the slow twitch, and if the load's too heavy for the smaller, then it will activate the next size up, the fast oxidative glycolytic, and if the load's too heavy for that fiber to overcome to generate enough force for, then it will activate the fast twitch muscle fibers. And this all happens in a millisecond. Bum, bum, bum. So even though you're doing heavy weights, that doesn't mean you're not activating slow twitch muscle fibers, because you are, because your body will activate the slow twitch first to test the load. Then, hey, that's too heavy, then we'll go to the next fiber type. Hey, that's too heavy, then I need the big guns, I need to bring in the fast twitch muscle fibers. So that's why you're going to get slow and fast twitch muscle hypertrophy, or increase in muscle size, by doing heavy loads relative to your strength, by all means, of that 5 to 10. Now you can go lower down to the 4s and 3s and 2s, but the more you go down to the 1s, and that's more powerlifting stuff, but remember that that's going to put high levels of stress on your body, the nervous system. If you do that repeatedly, you may find that you may easily overtrain and wear out, not just from muscular fatigue, but neural fatigue and hormonal fatigue, because you're putting this high level of stress on the body consistently. And as I shared, the body needs time to rest and recover and regenerate. So your ultimate goal in strength training is to get stronger, because your initial gains in strength will be what we call neuromuscular or neural adaptations. Neural adaptations that you find you get stronger very quickly, and you don't necessarily put on the corresponding amount of muscle size, because your body just uses what it's got more effectively. It uses the engine better or more efficiently. It activates more of the cylinders in the car that may not have been activated beforehand. For example, the body will straight away stimulate or recruit more motor units, which means they recruit more muscle fibers. And when you recruit, because if you're sitting on a couch, you don't need to recruit many muscle fibers. If you go for a walk, you need to recruit more muscle fibers, but not as many. But the higher the stress, the higher the load, the higher the force, the more motor units, the more muscle fibers you need to activate to generate tension and muscular force against that load to overcome it, to perform that amount of work or perform that task or lift that weight. So you want to be able to continually increase the load in that 5 to 10 repetition range and increase that. But when you first start strength training, your adaptations will be neurological. You activate more motor units. You'll increase the firing of those motor units, the neural drive. You activate those motor units in a more synchronized manner, so you start to become more effective in how you coordinate the activation to create a nice, efficient, effective muscular contraction. Over time, you get better synchronization and coordination between muscles to perform an overall complex lift. You also more preferentially start to activate the fast-twitch muscle fibers in the fiber, preferentially those fast-twitch muscle fibers that generate force. You are over time in a more complex lift start to deactivate the antagonist muscle groups that acts as a brake to movement patterns. So you decrease the sensitivity to your sensory organs, such as your Golgi tendon organ that monitors the amount of force in the muscle, so you don't hurt the muscle or break the muscle or tear the muscle. But that will adapt as you express high progressive amounts of force. It will increase its threshold to allow you to increase the force, and you also inhibit the activation of the antagonist that, as I said, is a braking movement to your agonist to protect the joint. I won't go too much into that, I've covered that in other sessions. So they're all neurological adaptations, and you can maximise that neurological adaptations in a matter of months, whether it be 2, 3, 4, 5 months. And understanding with some lifts, you can always develop your skill level on the bar path, and so you can increase your strength in a lift or performance of a lift without putting on muscle size, because you're just getting better at it, you're getting more skilled at it, you're getting more, you find that easier path for the bar, whether it be squatting or the pull down or row, and you get better at using what you got. But once they start to exhaust out and minimise out, then any further increases in strength will have to be from the laying down of muscle tissue, or laying down more actin-myosin filaments to build the fibres. So yes, your initial stages of strength will be through neurological adaptations, but once they become more exhausted, and you can always fine-tune them, such as an elite powerlifter or an Olympic lifter, people say, well, look at them, they're very strong, but they're not as big as bodybuilders. Well, because they're doing complex lift, they can get stronger by adapting their technique by millimeters. That's going to get them through that sticking point or that weak point to execute the lift, and they're not really and their lifestyle is not conducive to muscle size. Their lifestyle is conducive to power or lifts or technique or skills, because they measure their progress in a different way to the bodybuilder. So you can't compare those two, because they also got very different genetics. You know, an Olympic lifter or powerlifter generally won't have the genetics to become a great bodybuilder, because they're going to be probably more wide in the hips and have very big glutes, and they're going to be a bit shorter, and they have a lower center of gravity, and they have shorter levers to execute those lifts. When bodybuilding, it's not about that. It's just about purely aesthetics and how it looks. So they're going to want the narrow waist, the wide shoulders. It's not about performance, even though if they want to increase muscle size, they still have to follow the same principle of increasing the load over time, because if nothing changes on the bar, nothing changes on them, but it's going to be expressed according to their lifestyle, as according to their genetics. As an Olympic lifter or powerlifter, it's going to be expressed in a different way. So people can do that sometimes. I said, you know, look at these, and but they're different. It's like saying, hey, if I play basketball, I'll get tall. Well, the reason why they play basketball, because they're tall. If I want to get short, I ride horses, because jockeys are short and basketballers are tall. See, that's a very poor extreme example, because an argument from an extreme is many times a very weak argument. So, but what is one constant is that you have to increase your strength, because once those neurological adaptations are taking place, then any further increase in strength will be through muscle changes. Now, some population groups may not be so much, for such as women who won't have the testosterone to continue to actually put on a lot of muscle. The aging athlete like myself, I don't have the potential to put on as much muscle as I did when I was 20. So bodybuilding in my 20s, and I also did some bodybuilding in my 40s. And I found in my 20s, I just went to the gym, and as soon as I walked in, I started to grow. And now I'm in my 40s and 50s, I don't have those levels of testosterone, because they decline with the aging process. It means I can still get stronger, but I'm not going to have the physiological response of putting on muscle as I did in my 20s. But if I want to put on muscle, one thing I do have to do is I have to provide a progressive increase in load. And how you do that through your training and managing your training principles, your training components, whether it be your training frequency and your recovery and your nutrition and your lifestyle. Your whole goal has to be, I have to increase my strength, whether it be I'm doing 5 repetitions or 10 repetitions or 15 repetitions. It's not so much the repetitions, it's how much effort and how much load that you're lifting for those repetitions. So what is the ideal number of repetitions? Well, as long as it's anywhere between 5 and 10 or 5 and 12, then you're in that rep range of stimulating those fast-twitch muscle fibers. And as long as you're getting stronger, no matter what the repetitions, that's the most important thing. Some people say, oh, you want to get strength and power, you do 3 repetitions. If you want a muscle size, that's 12. Well, that's not correct from a principle of anatomy and physiology. You get bigger on both repetitions. You have to find the repetitions that you're comfortable with, that you like to lift, to get the results you want. Because obviously you have to enjoy your training, and if you go down to 5 and you find that's aching your joints and just wearing you out, then maybe you need to change your repetitions to a slightly higher rep range. where you're going to enjoy, take the stress off the tendons, stress off the joints, put more of the stress on the muscles, and you still progress, but you're still within that phosphate energy system range of activating those fast twitch muscle fibers and maybe some of those fast oxidative glycolytic fibers, the intermediate fibers, to get the results that you want. So repetitions is in that rep range, and be the best you can be in the rep range that you want to pick that's going to be best, that feels good for you, that you're going to get the best results from. Pick big exercises such as compound based exercises, because for a number of reasons. A, they're functional. B, you can lift heavy loads. The heavier the loads, the greater the load, the greater the force, the greater the force, the greater the motor unit recruitment the muscles have to do, the greater the tension, the greater the stimulus, not just on the muscular point of view, but also on the nervous system, and most importantly, the endocrine system, because heavier loads, higher stress is going to have a great reactive response in the endocrine system to, first of all, be a catabolic effect, to release cortisol and to release all the energy and to do the work, but also once that catabolic effect has occurred, then the body will go into anabolic if you provide the right environment that will be conducive to, okay, now I need to regenerate, I need to recover, I need to overcompensate, I need to build. So next time that big load comes along, I'm stronger for it, I'm bigger for it, I can handle it. So the bigger the load, the bigger the adaptation process, as long as you, but remember, the bigger the load, the bigger the stress, the more rest to rebuild those bricks, rebuild that muscle to get ready for that next load. So you may find that if you're doing big compound exercises, that a muscle can take up to 7+ days to fully regenerate and overcompensate. So if you're doing a big leg day, for example, or you're doing it just all over body, it may take up to 7 days, where a lot of people think the more is the better. But the more is the better means you're not actually maximising your overcompensation process, and what you'll find is that you're not recovering before your next training session. So you start to get diminishing returns, you start to hit training plateaus, you start to get a decrease in performance, and eventually you will get injury. That's pretty much a given because you're wearing the body out over a period of time. So you have to be smart about that recovery process. Good big exercises gives you good big results. And if you're doing the big compound exercises, you won't have to waste time doing the little supplementary exercises such as the bicep curls and the triceps. I'm not going to get into that, but if I'm doing a lat pull down, for example, what muscle fatigues first? My biceps and my lats? Well, my biceps does, because that's the weakest link in the chain. There's my biceps getting plenty of load, my lats are still getting load, but I'm getting a lot of bicep work. But if I go and do a separate day and doing bicep curls, then I'm wearing out this one that's already had been stimulated. Therefore, this one will overtrain. That will limit the progress of the bicep. But because this one's overtrained, when I go back to do my lat pull down or chin or my back exercises, well, this weak link is now weaker. Therefore, I'm not providing the amount of load and stress and stimulus on my big muscles. So that compromises the progress of your big muscles by wearing out your little muscles. So most of your results will come from the big exercises, the bench presses, the chin-ups, the seated rows, the deadlifts, the squats, those big exercises, because they also train the little muscles, because how can you train the big muscles in big movements without activating the smaller assistant muscle groups, the assistant movers, as well as your stabilizers and synergistic muscle groups. So good fundamental principles. A, pick repetitions that are in that scope of the phosphate energy system activating the big fast twitch muscle fibers. B, do big exercises to get big results, to stimulate not just the muscular system, the nervous system, but most importantly the endocrine system, because that is the system that stimulates and starts physiological changes, not just during the training to do the work, but after the training to stimulate the adaptation so the body can get stronger and lay down more muscle tissue. You find big exercises have a greater response in releasing testosterone and human growth hormone in the body than doing the little exercises, and research has shown that. And that makes common sense as well. The bigger the stress of the bear for the hunter, the bigger the physiological response for the person to get ready to overcome the bear as the hunter and gatherer. The bigger the task, the bigger the anxiety, the bigger the stress, the bigger the physiological change. So, but the beautiful thing is we can control the stress in the body through the weights and the exercises and the repetitions that we lift. So pick the big exercise that put a big physiological stimulus on the overall organism, not just a little isolated part, because just doing calf raises or bicep curls isn't going to put a big stress on the endocrine system, because it's not a high level of anxiety. I don't have to get psyched up when you go into a squat, you get psyched up because it's a full body movement. But and they're doing some bicep curls, you're talking to your bodybuilding partner or your girlfriend as you're doing it, it's not getting that same effect on the endocrine system. So remember, training is a stimulus, not just muscle. A lot of people think, I just need to stimulate the muscle. No, you stimulate the muscle by driving the nervous system to ultimately stimulate the endocrine system to release the hormones, initially the catabolic hormones, to do the work, but eventually to supercompensate to release the anabolic hormones to adapt the organism or the body to be stronger, to be able to deal with that increasing load that you're applying to it. So the ultimate goal of training is to stimulate the endocrine system through the nervous system and the muscular system, not just isolate it into the muscular system. The goal is to stimulate the endocrine system through the nervous system and the muscular system. So pick exercises that's going to put a high stress in the muscular system and the nervous system that's going to stimulate the endocrine system to go into an anabolic effect after the catabolic training that's going to be conducive to put on muscle size. So, and a lot of the time, the more you do with all the little exercise, what you're doing is you're intervening with that supercompensation process. You're actually shortchanging yourself because you're never letting the body fully recover. There's so many times I've trained, just recently, one of my students competed in the bodybuilding championships, and we designed the program, but he was doing lots of isolated stuff and lots of training sessions a week. And I said, and we basically went back to just doing 2 sessions a week, 2 full body sessions a week, 4 to 6 exercises. No squats and deadlifts and bench press and chins and rows, no isolated stuff, and that's all they did. And 2 things happened. A, now they've got plenty of recovery. So all of a sudden, his strength started going through the roof and he started putting on muscle size. And B, your training intensity goes up because now you've got a bigger gap between drinks. If you've got a big gap between drinks, you tend to drink a lot because you have to get through that time frame before you get your next drink. So if there's going to be a gap between train sessions, you train harder because you say, I'm not going to train for another 4 days or so I'm going to really put an effort in, and I haven't got a lot of exercise. I only got 3 or 4 exercises, therefore I'm going to put more intensity. You can train long and hard, but you can't do both. So the less exercises you do, and the bigger exercises you do, the more you put into the exercise to stimulate the muscular system through the nervous system to activate the endocrine system. So then you've got those 4 days after the training to fully supercompensate. And a lot of the people I've trained in the past, I've used to train them only once a week, full body, and they still put on muscle size. They competed in bodybuilding championships. They didn't do the isolation work, and they only trained once a week. And you put them on stage, and you couldn't tell the difference between them and everyone else who was training 4, 5, 6 times. But the other ones they were worn out, they were tired, and they had lots of injuries. Where some of the people I've trained, they don't have that because we trained according to the principles of anatomy and physiology, not just following some other person who's overtraining but may have genetics that we don't have a lifestyle we don't have, and has a commitment we don't have, but I can still train according to my principles, my anatomy and my physiology. So repetitions, 5 to 10 exercises, big compound exercises and big rests in between. So you want to be, if you're going to be training a muscle group and you're training it really intensely, you want to probably have 5 to 7 days rest in between. If that means you do a full body workout, you can put on, I've trained Olympic level athletes, high strength powered athletes, elite bodybuilders who are only training once a week at absolute tops twice a week, but then their whole body, their whole life is conducive to stimulate, recover, stimulate, recover, not stimulate, little recovery, stimulate, little recovery, wear out the skin. You have to live at time to recover, not just physiologically, but also psychologically, and making sure that you can also do it for the long period. Because if you want to put on muscle, I'm sure you don't want to put muscle on for a year and then never again and you lose it. You want to keep it and keep putting it on or maintaining it for the rest of your life. So you have to have a program that you can do, not just to get the goal, but you can do for the rest of your life that doesn't intervene with the other important aspects of your life, whether that be family or career or hobbies or recreation or sport it might be. Because ultimately, you don't want to just put on muscle for 6 months and I see that, when people are young, they put on muscle and then you see them when they're 40 and they don't even look the same. But you can be the same at 40 as you were at 20 if you train smart, if you take into account your genetics, look at design the lifestyle that's conducive to what you want to achieve, and you get the level of commitment, and you follow the principles, and you can maintain that for the rest of your life. And if you're not getting the results you want, then look at those principles and what you need. You might be overtraining, you might be training too often, you may need a week off. I believe after every 4 or 5 weeks you should have a full week off, let the body regenerate, fully recover mentally and physiologically. Doesn't mean you don't do other activities, but you may have a week off in strength training, that high intense strength training, if you're training really hard, and just let it reset and then re-get it, and you'll be amazed of how when you come back you'll be stronger. And you'll probably notice if you have a week or two off for whatever reason, you come back to the gym and you're actually stronger, because that's what your body done. It's actually recovered, you forced recovery, and you come back stronger. Why wouldn't you do that all the time rather than wait till you're overtrained to have a week off? Just make sure you train smart according to your life and how you want to live it. Another vital principle to ensure that is in place is you can do all the right training, you get all the rest, but you have to make sure you have the building blocks and the energy to build those blocks to build the body, which is your nutrition. So the energy comes from the macronutrient carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is energy. So you need energy to train, which is carbohydrate, and you need energy to build muscle or to lay down the muscle, which also comes from carbohydrate. But you also need the building blocks, which is the protein. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this because this is a whole session in itself, but you have to have the combination of the two. You need the energy to build the muscle. You need the carbohydrate to lay down the protein. And where does that come from? Obviously your food. So if you eat whole food, real food, less processed food, things as fruits and grains and vegetables and meats, lean meats, and if you eat mostly that, you're going to get all the macronutrients in its correct nutritional, natural balanced state from those foods. It's when man intervenes with food and starts to split them up and divide them and process them is where they can get a little bit out of balance and out of whack. But if you choose whole foods, and I use the principle, most of them are on the outside of the supermarket where the processed aisles are more on the inside. If you eat them, then you're going to get all the protein you need and all the carbohydrate you need to service your body to regenerate and build it and energize it for your next training session. So if you eat according to your activity level, so if you burn off say 3,000 calories a day or 2,000 calories a day, and if you want to go stay in an anabolic state where you're building muscle, you want to make sure you're having at least 3,000 calories. Because if you're having less than 3,000 calories, you're going into a catabolic state where you're breaking things down. So you want to make sure that your food intake or energy intake matches or is a little bit above your energy expenditure. That way you're going to be in an anabolic state. It means you're going to be in the building phase. You're going to have enough bricks to lay down, enough energy to lay those bricks down. Bricks being protein, energy means carbohydrate. If you eat them from the whole foods, you get them in the right percentages without worrying about taking extra supplements or powders or potions. And you can get all the required amount of carbohydrate, which might be anywhere between 3 to 6 grams per kilogram of body weight, not going to go into that, or protein, which is only 1 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And if you can get that all through your foods. And I've done this many times with elite athletes where I've looked at their nutrition and we've broken it all down and we've added up the grams of carbohydrate and protein and fat, and if they eat all whole foods according to the energy levels, they get the right amount which fits into those basic categories, which is based on research and based on the research out there of how much you need for elite performance. So from a food point of view, make sure you're having enough food or calories that match your energy expenditure. If you eat them from the whole foods or real foods, you're going to get the macronutrients in the right combinations naturally, and you're going to get the right amount to build what you want to build without having to take extra supplements, because supplements, you take extra protein, anything more than what you need is your body needs to burn it off or it's going to store it as fat. So therefore, get it from your foods. It's easy to get from your foods if you have the right amounts. If you eat regularly throughout the day, I'm not going to go into that, but you can get all your bricks for your muscles and energy for the carbohydrates to build the muscles that you want from a natural way, in a healthy way, but you also will get all your micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals, and your antioxidants that's also going to service your health at the same time. So that's the other principle that you have to make sure that's in place, because otherwise you're trying to build muscle with not getting enough bricks and not having enough energy to do the stimulus or to lay down the bricks, and that's easily achievable to do it from your whole real foods. Eat according. If you move more, eat more. If you move less, eat less. If you want to burn fat off, then obviously you need to go into a catabolic state. It means to eat less than what your energy expenditure. If you want to go into anabolic state, you need to eat more than what you require. But if you eat too much, by all means, you start to get fat. If you want to lose weight, you eat too little, you start to lose muscle because you're in a catabolic state. So it's that nice balance between anabolic and catabolic, and you have to manage that through trial and error to find eat according healthy, and then eat the amounts, the volumes, and see what's happening to your body. Is it growing, or is it putting on fat or putting on muscle, or is it actually losing fat or losing muscle, and adapt it accordingly. See you in the next KMAX, bigger, stronger, healthier, with more muscle, with a great life, with a commitment according to your genetics.